strong defender of the First Amendment and a firm believer in the need for the press to be unfettered in its pursuit of investigative journalism, the press to be unfettered in its pursuit of investigative journalism, to pursue unfettered investigative journalism, to have an unfettered ability to pursue investigative journalism. The president does support the ability of journalists in an unfettered way to pursue investigative journalism.
Welcome to this special edition of Sesame Street, a scandal-laden edition where the word of the day is unfettered. As you take a live look at the Capitol. I can't spell it, but I certainly know how to use it in a sentence. You connect it, Mika, to investigative journalism.
Yeah.
This really hasn't been Jay Carney's best week or two, unfortunately for Jay. A lot of frustration, not just among reporters, not just among Republicans, but as we heard last hour, Mika, even among Democrats, especially among Democrats, because the president obviously is the de facto leader of their party, and just how clumsy this White House has been dealing with these three scandals that have hit, and if you want to call them scandals, whatever you call them.
Yeah.
It depends on where you sit politically and what your definition is, but these three major stories, they just haven't been handled well.
Well, can you imagine the incoming at the White House right now? Mike Barnacle, by the way, Steve Ratner still with us, and joining us from Washington, the host of MSNBC's Hardball and author of Jack Kennedy, and elusive hero Chris Matthews, also editorial director of the National Journal Group, Ron Fournier, and here on set, the editor-in-chief of Newsweek magazine and the Daily Beast, Tina Brown. So, Joe, we got a great crew here to talk about these scandals.
Yeah.
The question is, do we start with IRS again? I think that's probably...
Well, I want to start really quickly. Before we jump in, I want to start really quickly with today's lead editorial in the New York Times and go to Chris Matthews, and then we'll set the stories up. Chris, as you always know, and as people in Washington knows, it's not always exactly what you did, it's how you responded to it. The White House has been dragging their feet. This morning, the New York Times talks about the Associated Press story and the White House's, quote, chilling zeal for investigating leaks. And then they say this at the end, which is just fascinating. These tactics will not scare us off or the AP. If you're inside the White House, Chris, and you have been inside the White House, and the New York Times is saying this to you and a Democratic administration, you will not intimidate us, you will not scare us off. How do you turn this story around, and how do you let the New York Times and your own base know that this isn't going to happen again, and you get it, you made terrible mistakes?
Well, you know, this whole, of course, when these firestorm like this happens, everyone goes to their battle stations and they go to their attitudes. And I do it as well as you do, and everyone else does it. You have a certain set of attitudes about this administration. And you may think they're the bad guys if you're on the very hard right, or you may have mixed views about it, like most of us do. But you go to what you think has been wrong from the beginning. And I will say what's wrong with this White House is the lack of a chief of staff in the White House who's a chief operating officer for the president. A clear line of authority from the top down, where every agency knows they're going to do something right or they're going to screw up, and if they screw up, they're going to pay for it. And it's going to come from the chief of staff, a guy like Jim Baker in the White House, who's watching out for the president, who's able to fire people on his own without the president's okay. In other words, a real tough ramrod for this administration.
Well, you know,
but everybody knows this administration isn't run like that.
Bill Daley didn't survive. Chris, these guys don't survive. Bill Daley is the chief of staff, and Bill Daley basically learned very early on, once he was in that job, that he wasn't going to be given the power to do exactly what you're talking about. Now, why is that? Why don't they have strong chief of staffs in there?
Because
that
it
can
starts
go tell
at
the president?
You and I are on the same page. You know exactly what the problem is. It's called operational control, span of control. This president is responsible for the federal government. He's responsible even if he didn't do anything wrong. He keeps acting like the only problem he's got, the only real problem he has viscerally, is the talking points in Benghazi, because that gets to Susan Rice, people close to him, and Michelle. He only acts personally. He is in charge of the entire executive branch. He is the boss. He needs a COO, someone who will carry out that authority every minute of the day through the weekend. He doesn't want to do that. He doesn't want to be chief executive because he doesn't want to have a chief operating officer. It's the way he's run the White House from the beginning, personally. And it's a real problem. And now he's getting blamed for things he knows nothing about because he doesn't want to know about them. He doesn't want to run the United States government. And that has been the problem. Why isn't he angry, really angry, about what happened with the IRS? He's only, look at him yesterday at that press conference. The only time he got really angry was when it was on Benghazi and the talking points, because that gets to him and his friends. And the problem is he's chief executive. It comes down to that, and every one of these problems. By the way, the story's going to haunt the Democratic Party, and everyone who believes in positive government is going to be this IRS story. This is perfect. This is going to help save Mitch McConnell. It's going to help Tom Corbett in Pennsylvania, help Cuccinelli. Anyone who's on that anti-government right that always says the government screws up in the end, they're out to get you, now has their case for next November.
All right, so looking at the first part of what you said, Chris Matthews, yesterday, of course, at the book signing with Chris Christie, the talk turned to politics, and we asked him sort of about the handling of these scandals. Take a listen.
You got to talk about it, both internally and externally. I mean, the first thing you need to do is to get the people who are responsible around you, because the president is ultimately responsible for everything, as is a governor, that happens on his or her watch, but they don't know everything all the time. So the first thing you need to do is get the people who are most responsible around you and say to them, how the hell did this happen? And try to get as much information as you can. And then you got to do that quickly. And then the next thing you need to do is not send surrogates out, not send other people out to speak. You need to get out there yourself and say to the people you're serving, like if this were happening in New Jersey, you know, I'd come out there and say, listen, here's what I know, here's what I'm going to do, here's how I propose to fix it.
You know, Ron Fournier, it sounds like Chris Christie is channeling Chris Matthews, and a lot of Democrats that have been frustrated with this administration, and we'll just use the phrase, domestically leading from behind. Healthcare, I remember during the healthcare debate, time and time again, asking Democratic congressmen, congresswomen, senators, so do you support the president's health care plan? They would laugh and they would say, when you figure out what the president's health care plan is, could you tell it to me? Because they won't even tell us. Chris Matthews is exactly right. This seems to be their mode of operation, this president's mode of operation, domestically and overseas, leading from behind, where he's blissfully unaware of all of this turbulence that's going on around him.
Look, in fairness, there are times when it's smart to lead from behind. And in fairness, there are some issues the president should not know about. But Chris is absolutely right. When the you-know-what hits the fan, the president's responsible. I was very surprised at the news conference when the president said on the IRS that it's an independent agency. And time and time again, Jay Carney's saying the IRS is an independent agency. Well, you know, guess what? It's not. It reports up through the Treasury Department. Yesterday, the president finally responded to the IRS in a very strong way to the IG report. And he said, I'm directing the Secretary of the Treasury to have every recommendation in the IG's report carried out, which, by the way, let's find out why they weren't carried out months ago. So how, on one hand, can you direct the Treasury Department to carry out these recommendations, but then say that the IRS is an independent agency? It doesn't make sense. It's a contradiction, and it's the oldest ploy that you do when you're a White House in besiege, which is try to fob off responsibility.
Chris?
You know, going back to the idea of this administration, because, you know, in second terms you get into trouble. You start promoting deputies to principal positions, and you're surrounded with staff people, therefore sycophants. And we all know how that works. You need people around you, a strong government led by a strong chief of staff that you can crack the whip. And this is why it's important to voters. When you go in that voting booth, you only get one vote. In fact, it's not a free will, it's a free choice. You get usually to choose between two candidates. You pick Romney, you pick Obama. When you pick Obama, you want to know that the steering wheel that you just turned to the left a little bit, you want that to matter. That means you want that president you voted for to run things. That's the only power you have as a citizen. Pick the person you want to run things, and then they run them. For anybody to run around in Washington and say, well, we don't run the IRS, or we can't control the Justice Department, and I'm recusing myself, and I'm recusing that. Everybody's saying the steering wheel doesn't control the car anymore. The voter out there says, wait a minute, I voted. I want the person I voted for to be in charge so I can vote against him or her next time. That's the only power I have. And you're telling me I don't have it because you don't have it. And that's going to really bug people, especially people that care about government doing a good job.
Yeah, Steve Ratner and then Tina Brown. Here's what Ron asks in the National Journal. Does Obama need staff shake-up to manage scandals? President Obama and his insular team are violating almost every principle of crisis management. While the West Wing is run by smart and dedicated public servants, their crisis communications instincts are horrible. They disassemble, they make things worse, they undermine the administration's credibility. Events of the past week likely will lead to one or more big, long-running scandals, which would be unfortunate for anybody, including me, who wants Obama to succeed. He needs to set aside his oft-justified contempt for the Republicans and the media, acknowledge his team's failings, and brace his administration for an onslaught. He may need a new team. Ratner.
So I think the points that both Chris made and Ron made in that piece are very apt, and ones that the administration should take to heart. The question whether they really have the resources there to deal with all this. But let's just parse these three things for 1 second, because in my mind the worst of them in a way is Benghazi, because of the talking points and because of the fact that the administration said one thing in October and November about how those talking points were drafted, and then the story changed and they haven't really fessed up, and poor Jay Carney's out there every day trying to do a tap dance, and it just, that one, the buck really does, I think, stop with them. I think when you get to the AP and you get to the IRS, in fairness, it gets a little more complicated. In the case of the AP, they set up a special unit to do this investigation, led by the D.C. U.S. Attorney for the D.C. Holder recused himself. The decisions were made by the Deputy Attorney General. I think you could have a discussion over how involved the President should be on that.
But Steve Ratner, let me interject here. If you're, hold on, let me interject here. If you're running your business, which you are, and you find out that this is going on underneath you, and you had no idea about it, would you be as passive as the President has been? Like Chris Matthews said, an IRS scandal tears at the very fabric of your philosophical belief in a large, aggressive, progressive, active government. This plays into the hands of your political enemies more than anything else. And I think what Chris is saying, not just the Democratic Party, but the American people want to see the President engage, and he is strangely passive. You wouldn't do that in your business. Chris wouldn't do that in his business. I wouldn't do that in my business. But you got the guy running the country doing it in his business.
But I'm just trying, I want to separate what he didn't know and maybe even shouldn't have known from what he should have done once he knew. And in the case of the IRS, it's not even really clear what the commissioner of the IRS knew, who then left, and now there's an acting commissioner and so on, let alone that it ever got past there. Once he found out about it, then I agree. There's been a sort of strange sense of passivity about this whole thing of, oh, we're going to wait for this report, we're going to wait for that report, and then we'll decide what to do.
Tina Brown, there's what you know and what you decide you don't want to know, and we've seen business people do this, we've seen politicians do this, we've seen the nod and the wink. So we don't know what the President knew, but it's certainly disturbing that he didn't come out immediately and said, this is a shock to me. I had no idea that this was going on under my watch, and damn it, I'm going to get to the bottom of it right now and make sure it never happens again. His passiveness suggests to me it may not be that clear-cut.
Well, you know, I think that Chris Matthews is absolutely right, though, about the circle round Obama. I mean, it seems to me that he has far too many adoring apparatchiks around him all the time. And in a sense, these kind of, any administration scandals happen, in a sense, when there's a kind of constellation of the weaknesses in the management style all kind of focus at a certain moment. And that's actually what you're seeing. You're actually really seeing the passivity that we have with Obama, the aloofness. We've had the same thing with Guantanamo, the lack of focus. with a great piece by Dan Kleidman this week, which talks about how, he's been constantly sort of dropped the ball on Guantanamo, made kind of efforts, but they're not really efforts. Then he gets exercised now because of the hunger strikes, and now he's going to try to come back at it. But unfortunately, all of these news scandals mean that he has very little political leverage so to do. So it's really, I think, exactly that. Same thing with foreign policy. We saw that the secretaries of state have very little room to move. There's not much authority that they're empowered with. Obama wants to be his own Henry Kissinger. He doesn't want to give strong people the ability to run, fire, deal with stuff. And now we're seeing what happens.
Mike Barnicle.
Chris, let's play back the last 8 minutes or so and what you've said, what Ron has said, what's been said here. It seems off of just these last 8 minutes, we have a president of the United States who has indeed had a couple of pretty strong chiefs of staff, Rahm Emanuel and Bill Daley. But we have also had at the same time a president of the United States who seemingly is surrounded by people who, when it comes to the IRS, is going after conservative groups, but don't tell the president this. When the Justice Department is throwing an electronic eavesdropping blanket over 100 Associated Press reporters in a national security issue, but don't tell the president about this. So is it not, are we not at the point where we have a president of the United States who may have some strong people around him at one point in time, but doesn't want that? He doesn't want that. It's a reflection on him.
Yeah.
You got to interview Billy Daley, but from what I understand, and Rahm Emanuel, when they took those jobs, they never asked for the power of hire and fire, which is essential to being a chief of staff. If the president will not delegate to a COO someone to run the government for him, then he has to run it himself. This president has no inclination to do that, but he needs a COO to do it for him every day. And when I worked for Tip O'Neill, every morning, the first thing he asked us, it went like a vacuum cleaner, and all great bosses do this. What do you know? What do you hear? Anything special? Anything I ought to know? I want to know everything. I run that information. And the idea that the president's chief counsel or his legal office learned 2 weeks ago, and Carney slipped that little baby out the other day, just let us know that, by the way, we did know about what was going on at the IRS. We did know about the IG report in some specificity. And we knew it, but somebody didn't tell the president this. And by the way, he does run the IRS. He runs the Treasury Department. Yeah. He runs the United States government, and he's accountable for it. And this is nonsensical that he's more outraged about Benghazi than he is about the IRS.
I would have loved Chris Matthews for somebody to try to tell LBJ, you're not in charge of the IRS, you're not in charge of Treasury, you're not in charge of the Justice Department. LBJ, FDR, again, progressives that believed in a strong, powerful government that could make things better for the American people, they would have laughed. Tip O'Neill would have laughed if you told them, you don't have oversight over these agencies. It's not believable, is it?
No, and I'll tell you, out there in the country now, people who have to pay their taxes, and every day if they get paid in cash, they get paid with a check, they see where the money went. It went to the federal government, a lot of it, for taxes. And now everybody who reads the papers, which is, I don't know what percent of the country, 80% that knows what's going on, at least through this kind of program, they're saying to themselves, wait a minute, IRS, oh yeah, they're the guys that target my political point of view. They're the guys that target the Tea Party and the right. Oh yeah, I get that. They're on the other side. So I'm paying taxes to the other side. This is the worst thing you can do about government, is undermine the basic trust that although it can be tough and tax rates can be tough on you, they're roughly fair, that they're not out to screw some group. Now, anybody out there in the country can say, hey, I don't trust these guys. They were targeting us. The gun people can say it. Everybody on the right can say it. The Republican Party, I'm telling you, this is worth 5 or 10 points to everybody out there that was ready to lose an election next year. And I tell you, this is Mitch McConnell's ticket to ride. He will not have a serious opponent. And you got to see Tom Corbett in Pennsylvania have a real chance to get reelected. Cuccinelli is loaded for bear with this baby down in Southern Virginia. This is his ticket right now. And so who handed him that ticket? A bunch of probably liberal public employees in the IRS who decided they were going to do something, whatever. But that's got to be grabbed, pointed out to. The president's got to make sure they all get fired, all the way to the top where anybody knew about this, and he's got to do it. or else it isn't going to get done. And next year, those same IRS people that have been involved in this are going to be there doing our tax returns next year. They will be the winners. They will be the ones that got away with this stuff. They used their little political attitudes, they put them to work, and then they get to keep their jobs. They win, the taxpayer loses. This is really serious business, this IRS thing, and it's not going to be forgotten for decades.
It does.
No, I think you're exactly right. Ron Fournier, let's go to you and end by talking again about a story we discussed yesterday. Ronald Reagan in the middle of Iran-Contra, again, a second-term president where his best lieutenants had moved on by that time. Nancy Reagan had Strauss come in and say, you've got to shake things up. Top Democrat in Washington, Democratic operative. And they got Howard Baker in there. And Baker got in and cleaned things up. You have with Barack Obama a man who is so isolated. It is the story that we hear, whether you're reading the New York Times op-ed pages or the Wall Street Journal op-ed pages. He's so isolated, and he remains this, what did Churchill say, of this, a mystery wrapped in an enigma, wrapped in a riddle, something along those lines. This keeps coming back. People say, why does the press keep talking about this man being so isolated? It's because it's having a great impact on his presidency and his ability to move forward over the next 3.5 years.
Yeah, he talked about it Friday, ironically, as these stories start developing. He gave a pretty eloquent speech about the lack of trust that the public now has with government, and he bemoaned that, as he does so well. He understands what's going on out there, and he talked about how the Republicans often demonize him and are obstructionists, which to a great extent is true. And he said, and I thought this quote was pretty remarkable, I would really like to do some governing. Well, do it. Do some governing. Be in front of these stories, especially, it's easy to lead from behind, and maybe even smart sometimes to leave from behind when things are going well. But when things are going bad, when your IRS is targeting your enemies, when your Attorney General and your Department of Justice is going after the Associated Press and putting a crimp on the First Amendment, maybe it's time, when your people are lying about Benghazi, which they did early on, and just continually shifting that story, maybe it's time then to do some governing.
Okay, Chris Matthews, we're going to see you this evening on Hardball at 5 and 7. Ron Fournier, thank you as well. Tina, you're going to stay with us, so hold that thought. Up next, Congressman Charlie Rangel joins us ahead on Friday's hearing in the Ways and Means Committee on the IRS's targeting of conservative groups. Also, NBC News Chief White House correspondent Chuck Todd, who had plenty of questions for Jay Carney at yesterday's briefing. You're watching Morning Joe, brewed by Starbucks.